Welcome to the Tech on Deck podcast, brought to you by Flatbed Safety Securement Group. I'm your host, Daniel Kinsman. Dan Shipley is sitting in the back room there, kind of hiding from everybody. He's your producer today, and today we are joined by Joel Morrow. Now, Joel, you've got a very unique business that you run, offering a unique service, probably the only one I could think of off the top of my head for the industry, where you actually do what do you call it? Efficiency proof of concepts.
Yeah, I mean, technically it's testing and consulting, but we're doing real world proof of concept essentially. And we're doing it sometimes with production equipment that just has maybe a unique set of specs. Sometimes we're running pre-production equipment that I can't talk about, and so it's kind of wild. It gets funky at times, and it's fun. So yeah, and it's not just one OEM that I'm working for. Of course, everybody knows that I do a lot of work with Volvo, but I also do a lot of work with Dana and BASF, and now Michelin's coming on board, and a few other OEMs that folks would recognize, and it's just been great the last couple of years. Things have really taken off for us, and it stays interesting and keeps me engaged, and it's been fun.
So, tell us a little bit about how you got into this and your experience within the industry?
So to start out with, I started as a driver. I'm still an everyday driver, actually. I've been driving just over 37 years now, and about just over 5 million miles behind the wheel. When I was younger, I was an outlaw, multiple logbooks, run the truck as hard as you could, just the stupid stuff that everybody does when they're young. Figured out that was a path to nowhere in a hurry. That it's going to ruin your health, ruin your equipment, ruin your driving career, essentially. And so once that realization really started to come into focus, we figured there's got to be a better way to do this, and that better way was operating efficiently. Efficiency essentially is money in the bank, and it took about a year to really truly understand that. I kind of knew it when I decided I had to change direction, or I was going to ruin my health and everything else, ruin my life essentially. It took about a year before I really started to bring things together, and I was probably 5-6 years in at that point when that realization hit me. So I've been 30 plus years working on fuel efficiency and productivity as well, not just fuel efficiency, and we've come a long way on the productivity end of things as well. So I've always worked either for myself or for the family business. My dad had a recycling business that we had our own trucks to service our own customers. I took one of those trucks and kind of went out on my own, had my own, I leased onto a company. I didn't have operating authority, but I'd leased onto Chem Lehman and to Bulkmatic, and I was doing some hazmat stuff and, plastic pellets and pneumatic tanks. I liked the challenge of the stuff that was a little more complicated to do, transloading out of rail cars, doing emergency silo pump outs with plastic, and even some food grade stuff I was doing at the time. Decided it would be a great idea to buy more trucks. I don't know why I ever thought that. And we had some trucks running. Can't say we done really well with them. I didn't know a whole lot at the time. Just thought it was a good idea to buy more, and got my butt kicked with that pretty well. So at the time I was doing that on my own. The family business had transitioned from recycling into transportation. And I was talking with my brother one day. He said, "Why don't you just come back to work, and we'll set you up kind of like research and development for us, and we'll work on specs and stuff." And that's what I did. I made a lot of contacts in the industry with the OEMs, and not just Volvo. We worked with Freightliner, worked with Cummins. And so I got to know a lot of people over the years. Um, the relationships that I developed really started to take off. A lot of the engineers that I worked with really started to trust my feedback, based on projects that we'd worked on over the years, and they felt confident working with me as kind of their field test guy. And one thing just kind of led to another, and it just got to the point where I was getting so many requests from engineers and engineering staff to work on projects that it was interfering with the actual trucking business that the family was running. So again, I decided to step out on my own with testing and consulting, and it's been 4.5 years now, I guess. And testing and consulting's done quite well. Just recently, I again have bought a couple of trucks to support testing and consulting. It's being run as Alpha Drivers Transportation, and we do haul real freight. It's power only stuff, and I haul a lot of stuff for the megas and dry vans. I do have a few direct customers that I work with from time to time when they get busy. Um, I try not to take on a lot of direct customers because I don't want to get into the situation that I was just in with my brother. I developed this relationship and they expect a certain level of service, and then I have somebody's engineering staff saying, "Hey, bring this truck down here for a couple weeks," you know what I mean, and put your customers on hold. So I have to walk a very fine line in regards to that. But I've been around the block once or twice. I've driven just about anything you can think of. I've done dump trailers, walking floor trailers, van trailers, pneumatic trailers, liquid tankers, both hazmat and food grade. What else? I haven't done any of the heavy haul stuff that you guys are into, though. I never got to that point, but just about everything else. Early on, a lot of construction and demolition debris out of the Philadelphia area. We would haul horse manure out of the racetracks from Ohio out east, and then we'd bring back construction and demolition debris. So we saw a lot of time in landfills on the working face and a lot of rough conditions that way. And today I'm just pretty happy pulling a van around doing the testing and consulting. I love the challenge of all that stuff, but I guess as I've gotten a little bit older, maybe I've lost some interest in the really challenging stuff. I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting lazy. Who knows?
Hey, sometimes the challenge can really be just getting that extra tenth of a mile per gallon out of it.
That's what it is nowadays. It's for me. It's the technical part. It's the thinking part. And um, when I look at myself today, and then I look at what I was doing 10 years ago, I, I can walk into the office in the morning and I've got page after page after page of handwritten math and calculations that I'd done that 10 years ago. I said, what the hell is that? You know what I mean? I would have never been doing that stuff. So it's odd how things change that way, but I love that part of it nowadays, and trying to kind of share and convey the things that I've learned to people. And my big thing was, how can I do this and get it to the average person without having to charge them a fortune? All of the OEMs can afford me. Your average owner operator probably can't. And to me, it was super important for that average owner operator to have that information, because that can make or break a guy nowadays. You don't understand today's technologies, and you're going to get into a bunch of trouble maintenance-wise and operationally with your truck. And over the years, I've been able to develop the relationship with the OEMs that I work with, where they're okay with me giving out, I would say 60 to 70% of the stuff that I work on. They allow me to share that free of charge, and I think there's some value to that for a lot of people, especially if you're in the market for a new truck and you're trying to understand today's technologies.
So, have you found that today's modern trucks, even with all the computers, are actually easier to squeeze that little bit of fuel mileage out of, or are they becoming more complex as you're chasing that last bit of efficiency?
Well, they're more complex. There's no question about that. They're more complex. I think ultimately the question is the total cost of ownership lower? And if you do it right, there's no question that it is. Today's trucks, if you understand what you're doing, if you've spec'd the truck right and you spec'd it in a way that works with your operation and you understand why you're operating the way you're operating, the cost, the total cost of ownership can be driven way down. In fact, it's probably been 3-4 years ago on my brother's fleet, was the first time that he had emission engines that were coming in at a lower cost per mile than the last round of non-emissions electronic engines that were on the market. And I think at that point he had Kenworths with Caterpillars in them. And when you look at the maintenance cost per mile and the fuel efficiency, and you bring all that stuff together, he was just slightly lower. So there's no question in my mind that when things are done correctly, things can be very good for an owner-operator. And that's the whole caveat. If you screw this up, it can cost you a fortune.
So yeah, there's really not one size fits all for anything. It's just if you want to get that efficiency, you need to know your operation, tailor it more towards your operation.
That is true, and that was very true when the first emission engines came out. I mean, in fact, you could take 3 dry van operations, and they may have required 3 different specs. There wasn't a lot of versatility in the specs because we were pretty crude in the beginning with the Gen 1 emissions. Nowadays, as we aggressively downspeed, and this is something that I just harp on constantly, and it's very important to understand what downspeeding is. It gives you a lot of versatility, and what we're finding is, like with the new iTorque spec trucks, that spec may apply to 3 or 4 different types of operations that are completely different, but it has the versatility to adapt not only operationally, but in terms of the emission systems and the durability to operate in those various duty cycles. So that's making things easier. I think one of the problems that we bump up against is that spec looks significantly different than what trucks have looked like in the past spec-wise, and it gives guys a little pause. They're seeing rear axle ratios they've never seen. They don't understand why. How often do we talk about people actually doing tractive effort calculations to understand how that truck's going to pull in any given gear at any given speed, and all that stuff's extremely important. And it's things that we've never really done in the industry at the owner-operator level and the small fleet level, and these are things that I try to bring up and explain to people so they can have some confidence in the trucks that they're putting together.
Now, you do a lot of, when I watch your various posts about efficiency, you're doing a lot where you're focusing on 6x2 with weight biasing and the ability to shift weight forward and backward.
Mm-hmm.
That's a concept that is old for a lot of the world,
Mm-hmm.
that they've been doing for years, but we're just now seeing it come into America. Are you getting a lot of pushback from people in America, or is it the global connectivity that we now have? People are getting exposed to it, so when they see you doing it, they're like, "Oh, I actually kind of grasp that."
The 6x2 in particular, we actually had some weight biasing 6x2s way back in the day, and the 6x2s were a little more common than what most people realized. GMC on the old cracker boxes, they had a lot of 6x2s. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of steel in northern Ohio was hauled on 6x2s with 318 Detroits, but I think what happened back in the day when essentially we were gearing all trucks the same and we didn't have a lot of differences in power curves, all the engines made horsepower essentially at 2100 RPM. There was not a lot of efficiency and kinetic energy that we could kind of leverage in those types of specs. And without being able to do that and understanding that, the 6x2 loses a lot of relevance, and then we'd have high tractive effort, and we'd get a lot of tire wear, and they became problematic. So everybody gradually shifted to the 6x4. Drivers got accustomed to it. That became the standard. 6x2 was reintroduced, I'm going to say the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s. Some of the engineers recognized the kinetic energy potential advantage, but when they packaged them, they essentially just said, look, we'll just rip a drive shaft out of there and run it down the road. And it didn't work, and it really, really poisoned the well, so to speak. Drivers were getting stuck in parking lots after a little bit of a rain. You know what I mean? They were horrible. There was no weight biasing going on to speak of. And there were a lot of other things that we didn't understand even after we got the weight biasing. And one of the important things to understand is in order to achieve tractive potential on par with a 6x4, a 6x2 has to get 25% of gross combination vehicle weight on the drive axle. Once you understand that number and can start to move that, they're phenomenal. They're just fantastic. Then we had the issue is that, of course, everything in America is a race to the bottom in terms of components on the truck. What's cheap, you know? So torque reactive air ride suspensions are cheap. When we have torque reactivity, that kicks that 25% number around as the frame comes up, especially when we're light. So it creates a whole nother set of issues that we had to deal with. And we did. We've got some pretty decent non-torque reactive suspensions. So now we're maintaining the contact patch size on the tire. We're not shifting weight every time we bump a gear going through the, accelerating and when we're light. And we've got some pretty sophisticated torque management going on these days that also helps with the 6x2. I think what really, really helps moving forward is the combination of that non-torque reactive suspension and then these aggressively downsped trucks. It gives me the choice of up to 3 gears at any given highway speed. That also means I can very accurately manage horsepower and tractive effort at any given highway speed. Something we can't do like in a direct drive truck that puts all the horsepower and torque available in one gear. I divide it up into 3 different buckets, and I guess the way that I like to look at this is if I had a 45-gallon bucket and I'm trying to pour water into a little glass, it's kind of tough to do, and that's essentially what we're doing with a direct drive setup. With an I-torque, with the overdrive and the aggressively downsped ratios, now I've got 3 10-gallon buckets, and it's much easier to pour that water into a small glass, and that's how I kind of picture that in my mind. I'm managing tractive effort and horsepower through a 6x2, and when we do that, it's magic. I mean, we get just phenomenal numbers, and we see that with the numbers the boys are putting up. Travis and Connor's, he's a new driver with no experience, and he's actually, his fuel mileage numbers are slightly better than Travis's. From a new guy, he's significantly over 10, and he's only been driving truck for 6 months.
He doesn't have those bad habits to break.
Well, he doesn't. That is true. But I mean, he had no mechanical background. He wasn't a farm kid. He wasn't any of that. He played video games, and so we kind of gamified things for him and he's still in training. We're getting ready to cut him loose as soon as I get another truck here where I can dump him in. But he's just going to do fantastic, and he understands why he's doing what he's doing. He doesn't really understand the specs of the trucks yet, doesn't quite get what any of that means, but he understands why he's doing what he's doing, and that to me is the most important thing for a driver to understand. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to get 58,000 opinions, and you're not going to understand who's right, who's wrong, what do I do? And so we've worked hard with him, and he's going to do well, and it's going to be interesting to see when he gets out on his own.
So now you've got the 6x2. Are there any, I would call 6x2/4, where you could lift a lift a powered drive axle. Is that an option, or are they
So
working on it?
it is in Europe. I don't. Here's the thing. When you have the weight biasing right, the only time that the liftable 6x4 makes a lot of sense is if you're in a vocational application that spends a lot of time on the highway. Then it starts to make sense. If you are strictly on highway, it's a lot of added cost and weight that you simply do not need. A correctly configured 6x2 with a non-torque reactive suspension and the right torque management in place, you've got some tractive potential that goes way beyond what most people would even imagine, and they'll embarrass a 6x4 a lot of times. In fact, the weight biasing is getting so good on the Volvos nowadays that they're going to offer weight biasing on a 6x4, essentially making it a 6x2. Now you're not going to be lifting that axle, and there's no clutch, but when you get into a challenge with traction, it's going to work just like the 6x2, because the 6x2, once you meet that 25% threshold, it has more tractive potential than a 6x4. So this is going to be something moving forward that I'm hoping that we can kind of educate people and kind of reinvent, because there's significant fuel efficiency advantages to a 6x2. Some of the things that I've been learning working with the folks at Dana Corporation, which kind of surprised everybody, was efficiency on drive axles is always rated under maximum torque load, and the axle is designed to be most efficient under torque load. And when you look at a 6x4 tandem, they're about 94% efficient amongst all brands. That they run right around 94, some maybe touch 95, but they're right around there. A 6x2 is around 97%. And most people look at that and say, well, you can't justify it. And I would agree if that were the only thing that we were looking at. Under full load, there's maybe 3% efficiency difference, which is a very small fuel efficiency gain when that's translated. Where we're finding the difference is when that load comes off the axle, that torque load, efficiency drops dramatically for all ratios and all brands of axles. You get this drop off in efficiency when the torque load goes down, or even when you're eco rolling, efficiency drops substantially in the axle. What we found is that these aggressively downsped ratios like 205, 195 even, are significantly more efficient because that large pinion is spinning slower in that heavy oil back there. And so your roll windows and your ability to leverage kinetic energy goes through the roof compared to traditional ratios, which essentially it's almost like a fluid brake back there with the smaller pinion gear, on like a 336 or a 342, 355, whatever you pick. So there's a dramatic difference in efficiency when we're not under peak torque load. And when you think about the average truck's duty cycle, you're not at peak torque load very often, right? And because there's so much variance in the duty cycles when you are under peak torque load versus not, engineers struggle. Your duty cycle may be completely different than mine. But that being said, neither one of us are going to be at peak torque load all that often. Engineers deal with a given, so they say, okay, at peak torque load, here's the efficiency. Never thought about looking at off-peak load efficiencies, and the guys at Dana started looking at that after I'd given them some feedback over the years, and their jaws about dropped. They're like, we didn't expect this, you know what I mean? And so this is really, I think, going to help open up the door again to the 6x2 to explain why it can be more efficient, how you have to operate it, and then how you have to spec it. Two things that we didn't know in the past. We didn't really understand why it would be more efficient. We couldn't explain that. And obviously, if we couldn't explain that, we couldn't say, here's how you need to spec or operate this. So I would expect we may see a resurgence on this. I'll be putting out a lot more information over the coming weeks as I get more and more feedback from the partners that I work with.
So, as you're discussing like an aggressively drivetrain,
Hmm.
explain to the public what that means and why you have to design an engine specifically around that theory of drivetrain.
So down speeding, I think a lot of people confuse it with maybe going slower. It's not road speed. We're talking about engine speed, and really we're talking about the entire speed of the powertrain. Um, Rotating mass creates drag, and the faster we rotate mass, the more drag we have, the more friction we have. Also in the engine, we get pumping losses and thermodynamic losses, and there's all kinds of losses as RPM goes up. Yeah, horsepower goes up, but that horsepower starts to get very expensive in terms of efficiency. So today what we try to do is we try to bring that power on very, very low in the RPM range. And in order to do that, we have to look at some of the engine architecture, the basics of the engine to achieve reliability that we've come to expect over the years when we start to slow these engines down and put out a lot of horsepower. So Volvo's really, in my mind, has really led the way in this. When you look at a Volvo crankshaft, you pull it out of a D13, and I know this will hurt a lot of people's feelings, but it's just massive. It has more journal overlap. It has more bearing surface area than a Cummins or even a Cat, even a C16 Cat. When you start to look at journal overlap and bearing surface area, nobody beats a Volvo. They've done an excellent job on that. The next thing we have to look at is the geometry of the rotating assembly itself, and in particular the rod length in the engine. So in the past, the way we've always achieved torque was to have a long stroke, and Cat and Cummins were always famous for having, a lot of torque, and they felt good underfoot to the drivers, and that was because they had long throw on the crankshaft with a relatively short connecting rod. And that's great for the feel that the driver gets or how it applies power, but it creates a lot of thrust load on the liners and the piston. So you get a lot of scrubbing action because it leans that connecting rod over really hard into the liner. And Volvo went just the opposite direction. They went with a shorter stroke on the crankshaft with a longer connecting rod. Now, a lot of people will mistake stroke with connecting rod length, and that is not the same thing. The stroke is always determined in the crankshaft. The connecting rod length is going to determine how tall your block has to be. It doesn't add any more stroke to the engine with a longer connecting rod. So what it does do, though, the longer rod, it has several efficiency benefits. Obviously, if we're standing straighter, we have less thrust load into the side, so we reduce a lot of drag on the cylinder wall or on the liner wall. We also have more consistent speed through the stroke. So as you get to a more extreme angle with a shorter rod, the piston speed actually varies through the stroke more. So you have faster and slower sections through the stroke, which can be challenging for timing on fuel delivery, and it creates some challenges. There's no doubt about it. So when you do have that longer rod, we have a much more even speed through the stroke, and we also have more dwell time at top dead and bottom dead center, which can be beneficial as well. What we do lose is the acceleration, that rapid acceleration away from top dead center. That's what the Cat and the Cummins guys love. That you step on it and vroom, vroom, that's what they feel is that acceleration away from top dead center. And there really has been no way to overcome that until recently. Now today we can do multiple injection events. We can kind of encourage that piston to move a little faster if and when we want to. We can also rely on some variable geometry magic in turbos or turbo compounding as well. That we can do some things that really help with that punchy feel that we would get with that rapid acceleration away from top dead center. So it's kind of interesting. I'd thrown this concept out there before, and I took a lot of heat on this concept about the short stroke, longer rods. Well, why wouldn't everybody do it? And it's kind of funny because Cummins just came out with a thing for their 2027 engines. They're doing the exact same thing. It just makes sense. I mean, it's math, it's engineering. Everybody's going to that now. I think we're going to see PACCAR probably as the last holdout, but I think at some point they're even going to come around on that. So it'll be interesting to see as all these engines are updated with better geometry under rotating assemblies. I think everybody's going to get very, very efficient. I think efficiency is going to go up across the board. Durability is going to go up across. It's going to be good for everybody, and so it's going to be helpful.
Say, for a lot of people that really don't know, there's a variety of engine types out there. They have a Napier Deltic that was an opposed piston engine. Mm-hmm. The issues they had until really the last about 20, 25 years is we didn't have a good enough understanding of how everything functioned internally to model to be able to avoid the sudden failures of the engine that would be catastrophic, and to know how to design around it. Like the Volvo piston, the head is actually a very unique design, but that's because recently they were able to actually, the last decade or a little bit more, they actually started to understand how everything worked inside the combustion chamber. That's allowed them to improve efficiency there.
Some very interesting modeling going on, and you can see it in real time, and it's really cool. Watch the spray pattern going in. The Volvo wave piston is kind of a unique setup, and in fact, on the newest engine, they added a seventh wave and a seventh hole into the injector, and it's really cool to watch the computer modeling on how that flame front turns in on itself, concentrates the burn in the center of the piston so we're not losing heat out the cylinder walls. It's really cool stuff. You're right. It's definitely interesting. And the opposed piston engines, I love them. I love them. They kind of the German, the Yonkers JU87s had them, and cool stuff. Really cool stuff.
Cummins has been testing their opposed piston that they got from Acadis, which I can't remember the name they were before, but they were a DARPA project, and they're starting to actually test those. And it's like the reason we hadn't seen that very much was because we didn't really understand what was going on to the level that we now can with actual computer simulation.
Acadis had called me and they wanted me to retrofit a truck. And I wanted to do it in the worst kind of way, but I'm just simply not big enough. If I have problems out on the road and then it becomes problematic for me, I wasn't big enough to do it. And I think they understood that, but the guy's like, man, I'd love to have you do this. And I was like, I can't make this work. And I would have loved to. That's kind of a cool. The only downside was the Acadis being a two-stroke. It still sounded like the old two-stroke Detroits. They were a little noisy, but hopefully they overcome that part of it. I wasn't thrilled about. Of course, I come up on the old two-strokes, and some guys think it's cool, but it gets old after a little while.
Sometimes the modern trucks are nicer because they're just quieter.
There's no doubt. Yeah, for sure. I started, I learned on a 1968 4070 International day cab with a 318 Detroit, battleship gray steel interior, no air ride seat, air assist steering, air wipers, all the bullshit back in the day. And I know a lot of guys talk about the good old days. You can keep them. I got no use for it. Now they're fun to drive on occasion. I will admit that. I love to jump in an old Detroit on occasion, especially if it has a 13 or an 18 speed in it, and just float the gears, and I have a good time with it. But would I want to get back in one full time to conduct business in? There's no way in hell. Ain't gonna happen.
The technology change. I've only driven myself since 2011, but I've been around the industry since the mid 90s. So seeing how everything's progressed from the FLD and the FLB cab overs and the 9600 International that so many fleets ran.
Mm-hmm.
It's like being able to look at that and say, this is a modern truck now. Those were nice for back then, but
Oh yeah, yeah.
there's no way. There's no comparison. And
You know what? Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, like, a big part of it also really is you can look at Peterbilt and Kenworth. A lot of their models, the W900, the 389 that has just recently went out of production. That is such a throwback truck. Even though they've tried to improve it and make it modern, it has still got a lot of the same issues they had back 30 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The thing I find amusing, I guess, is, and I'm on social media quite a bit, and I'll see these younger guys talking about how great this was back then, or that was, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, if you only knew. But the thing that really I just find funny is you'll get a younger guy saying, whether it's a 892 Detroit or a VT 903 Cummins, one of the V8s. Oh man, they had a lot of power. They had this and that. That simply was not the case. It just was at the time. Sure, yeah, they were a powerhouse, but today, and this is funny to me. My D11s that I spec'd for my brother in his short regional trucks at 425, 1550. Had the exact same horsepower as the 3408 Cats that were coming out in the day, and they were, they're huge, massive engines, but power density just wasn't there. Fuel efficiency was horrible. They had some crankshaft challenges with that type of stuff. We ran gobs of 892s, and I'll tell you, the only decent 892 I ever bumped up against was right at the end. We got a hold of an electronic 892. That was a fantastic engine. I really enjoyed that truck. But the other ones, they made a whole lot of noise and didn't go anywhere. You know what I mean? They just didn't, unless you sunk thousands of dollars into them. They're big, they were heavy, they didn't last long, and when you start to compare total cost of ownership on that, could you imagine having to put rods and mains in an engine every 200,000 miles today? People would go absolutely bonkers. That was just normal back then. 200,000 miles, we'll roll rods and mains in it. 500,000, tear it down, overhaul it, and everybody thought they had a good engine. And people seem to have forgotten that stuff. Alternators, constantly. Batteries, constantly. Series parallel switches, when they had a 1224 systems. I mean, all that nonsense, and clutches, brakes, bias ply tires. Okay, so you got to... I guess if you never lived through that, you don't really realize how awful it was. And it was awful. It just was.
Look at recently I saw floating around somewhere on the internet. There's a picture of PIE, the Pacific Intermountain Express, their yard, their terminal, where they were like, these trucks come in every 125,000 miles, and they pull the engine out and rebuild the engine. It's like, could you imagine if fleets had to deal with like every 120 once a year we have to pull the engine and rebuild it?
Yeah. At the end of the year, just rebuild the engine. Yeah.
They just accepted it. Okay, so every 125,000 miles, it's like we can't imagine they were doing that because the engines were brute forcing their power. Basically, it was just throw more fuel at it. If you need more power, you just turn the fuel and pump up.
Even if you're not burning it, just keep throwing the fuel at it. You know what I mean? And we'll worry about the fuel dilution later. We'll just rebuild the engine. That's the way that stuff worked. And I don't know. You hear these guys just constantly talking about how great it was back then, and having lived through that, I cringe. Man, oh man, if these guys only knew what a pain in the butt that actually was. Bias ply tires down south in the summertime were the worst.
Yeah.
I can remember I can remember one time riding with one of my dad's drivers, and we were going to Atlanta, and between we just had gotten through Cincinnati, so we must have been right in the Lexington area. Blew the first tire. We went through 6 tires, brand new tires, by the time we got down to Atlanta, and it was 103 degrees that day, and it was a faster truck, and I mean, but that was normal, and everybody just kind of accepted it. It was just the normal thing. And could you imagine that today?
And that was part of why back then drivers changed their own tires, was because, I
Absolutely,
mean,
yeah.
for one, they didn't have the communication devices that we have,
Right.
but also just, even if you could, by the time you went through 4 or 5 tires in a day, that road call, you couldn't waste that much time. You
Oh
needed to
no,
just
yeah,
pull over
yep,
real quickly, pop a tire
yep,
off.
yep. No, that's the way that's the way it went. And yeah, we've had truck drivers in my family. Oh Jesus. Well, my great grandpa drove. My grandfather drove for Norwalk Truck Lines, and he used to make a turn to Boston, and it would take him an entire week to run Boston. It just did. That's what it took him. I was running Boston for Norwalk Furniture, and I'd make 2.5 trips in a week. You know, it was just the way it was. So it's people have short memories or no memory, and I guess that's the part we're dealing with nowadays. I got into trucking extremely young. You know, I was around it my entire life, and I started driving at a very early age. So I guess I have some recollection of things that, you know, your average 30 or 35-year-old today, no clue. They listen to the songs from back then. They watch the movies, and they think, "Oh man, that was great." Not so much.
The the pay has changed. We haven't gotten the pay raises that it should have been, just constantly going with the industry. And that's kind of what made the industry better in a lot of people's eyes, was drivers back then could support a family and then still had that
I,
extra money to just,
oh,
every day I'm going to go in and get a meal at a truck stop and sit at the
no
trucker's
doubt.
counter of knowledge. That
No,
trucker's
no
counter
doubt.
of knowledge
Yes.
was just legendary.
No doubt. So, and this is one of the things that I really, really have struggled with. I started driving not too long after deregulation. And I can remember in our area, trucking was an upper middle class job. It just was. Your wife did not have to work. You had 2 cars. You had a small boat. You might even have a little cottage down at the lake as a truck driver. That's how it was. Um, when we deregulated, unfortunately, I think we deregulated the safety part of things. When we done deregulation, there should have been some protection for company drivers' wages. Pay by the mile should be outlawed. There's just no question in my mind that it's dangerous. It forces guys to take risks. We should also get overtime as company drivers, not as owner-operators, as company drivers.
Because let's face it, when you're a company owner, you're lucky sometimes if you get a paycheck.
So well, that can be true, but if we think about this, if we take care of company drivers, that rising tide raises all boats, and rates would go up across the board, and there is no sane reason that we are letting company drivers get paid by the mile and not give them. Why do we give everybody else overtime? You know,
My big thing is I understand when the industry went to the pay by the mile process, the scheme, it was because you couldn't track the driver. Once the driver left the yard, most companies didn't really want to run a tachograph. For
well,
those of you that don't know, there used to actually be a piece of paper you put
So
down.
a disc. You put a disc and it looked like a big old gauge, and you lock it in there. And we ran tachographs, and so it was absolutely possible to do. There's no. In fact, my dad did pay his guys by the hour. It was absolutely possible to do. I think obviously when we deregulated, all of the effort or all the focus went on productivity, because it really dropped the cost of transportation. Then we're like, oh my God, if we can get more productive, let's just pay these guys by the hour so they run their ass off. No, we don't want to run a tachograph because we don't want no proof that we're telling the guys to run 3-4 logbooks. That is essentially what happened. We had a bunch of greedy transportation executives that brainwashed the drivers. And we're still brainwashed to this day. You will get feedback on this. That's bullshit. I want to get paid by the mile and yada, yada, yada. You're going to hear that. And it is nuts.
And we had when deregulation happened, that was right when the industry was going from, like, for people that don't know the history, Freightliner was started by Consolidated Freightways, by a trucking company, the founders of which actually could drive their own trucks. They knew how to drive. They
Hmm.
weren't they weren't people that just grew up in college. Well, that whole generation that started the companies that shaped the industry up to deregulation, they were all retiring. They were all sadly passing away. And then it went to their children, or it went to boards of directors that they had never driven. So deregulation happens, and suddenly it's just a real easy. Hey, this is the easy way out, and we don't know what it's like to actually drive the trucks to do the job, but this seems to be better in our eyes, and it's like that's not how the industry worked.
Yeah, I think you're right. They lost touch with the core industry. The manufacturers certainly have, and even within the manufacturers, you got a lot of compartmentalization, where you have a guy that makes a component for a fuel pump, but doesn't make the entire fuel pump. He's probably the best guy in the world at designing that component, but he has no idea how it's actually being used in the fuel pump, and then what other stresses and strains are placed on that pump. So that compartmentalization that you're talking about is absolutely a problem. And I think the reason we have it is because the pay is so poor in the industry. Who in the hell in their right mind nowadays, if you're not working for the right person, wants to drive a truck? I mean, you think about the hours that we put in, the time we spend away from home. I mean, I loved it, and that's why I done. I didn't do it for the pay. I just done it because I love driving truck. And looking back on it, I probably shouldn't have. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I spent a lot of time and a lot of miles on the road where it sucked. It just did. Um, and it's sad to say. It doesn't have to be that way, and I think the way that we fix the industry and improve our safety and do a lot of things is outlaw pay by the mile. There has to be a time value component with overtime for company drivers, and that will help fix the rest of the industry as well. But
I've so
until we
one of
do
the
that,
things,
we're going to struggle.
yeah, one of the things I've been pushing for, I actually wrote a whole big document on it, is, for one, the U.S., we increased our truck sizes and weights when we deregulated,
Hmm.
and we went up to where you could have a 53-foot trailer.
Hmm.
But we should have also been increasing over the years. We should have been doing incremental increases from 80,000 pounds to 88,000 pounds to slowly bringing our gross weights up as the rest of the world started doing that, because it creates an issue of safety for importing, exporting, like on intermodal containers. I
Hmm.
mean, say what you will about it, but the rest of the world loads an intermodal container, they pack it to the gills, then it comes over here, and now those drivers are like, well, I'm actually kind of overweight, but
Right.
I'm just gonna kind of
Yeah.
bootleg it over here because
Yeah.
it's not
That's what you do. Right.
it's not loaded for our standard. But
Right.
the other thing that I really have been doing a lot of is, and since you go to Europe a lot, you probably know they have the STGOs, and the drivers are actually licensed, but the companies are also licensed for that.
Sure.
And it's like, we need to look at truck driving. It's no longer adequate to just have a CDL that, hey, you get a Class A and you can drive any size vehicle.
Yes, you're talking
It,
about that career pathway, and there
yeah,
is none. And the sad part, or the reality of this is that if I go to any fleet in the United States to simply drive the truck, anybody out of driving school with 6 months can take my position. They'll make the exact same pay as me. I'm no more valuable to them than the guy that's fresh out of school. In fact, because I've been around for so long, I might be a pain in their ass because I'll start asking questions. And they don't want to. They'd rather deal with a fender bender on occasion than a driver that's going to ask questions. So you're exactly right. Instead of focusing on raising the speed limit all the time, we should have actually slowed the trucks down, made them longer and heavier, and then built that pathway that you're talking about with multiple tiers in your license. So then a guy like me at the end of his career, he would have been at the top of the totem pole, and he would have been rewarded for staying in. We don't have a pathway. our industry's a mess. It just is. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do to straighten things out, and that pathway, the career pathway, is certainly one of the things that we've really got to look at hard. What are we doing here? You know?
And I'll even say, like one of the things I identified years ago was we should also be creating corridors. For instance, a freight corridor, New York City to Chicago. The amount of truck traffic between Interstate 80, Interstate
Mm-hmm.
76, and then coming
Mm-hmm.
over to 80, 80, 90, where you're coming through Ohio all the way. The amount of truck traffic, we should be taking routes like that and saying, hey, we're going to handpick. It might only be initially you pick 5 companies, and those 5 companies can each get 25 drivers. But these
Mm-hmm.
guys are going to be able to run double 53s. These are
Mm-hmm.
guys that have the safety,
Yeah.
and your company's background is a safe company, and
Yep.
you can run this quarter, and it'll be just from this
Yep.
point to this point.
Yep.
That will increase the efficiency of the vehicle. But then now you've
Yep.
got other drivers in the company. Hey, if I want to step up to that, that
Yep.
is you have
Yep.
to prove.
Yeah.
I used to tell when I trained for a short while. I used to tell my students, protect your license and guard it because that's your future. Do everything to protect it. Don't let other
Mm-hmm.
people take it away from you by pressuring you to do something stupid.
Yeah, I 100% agree. You know, it's solving all the world's problems here and the problems of the industry. You know, this really just boils down to a few certain things. You know, we need to create that pathway. We need to pay by the hour instead of by the mile. There has to be time value attached to that. And if there's not time value attached to this, we're going to continue to struggle with safety. We're going to continue to struggle with driver turnover. You know, all the things that we continuously complain about, we'll continue to struggle with. And I don't think that the big fleets, I don't think they mind dealing with that. It's okay for them to have that turnover. Uh, it's much harder to deal with paying your people fairly than it is to deal with driver churn. Now that being said, if there were legislation on the federal level where everybody had to do it and we were put on an even playing field, I think that would change a lot of people's minds. I've talked to a lot of CEOs of bigger fleets, and they all say the same thing. Well, I would do it if the other guy would do it too, but they're not going to do it, so I can't do it, you know, that type of thing. So this is what our government's here for, to recognize when they can make a difference. And, you know, our supply chain and transportation, that's national security issues we're talking about right there. Our supply chain breaks down, people starve to death, people die, they don't get their medicine, they don't get fuel to move their vehicles, to heat their homes. And, you know, a lot of times the economy is running on the back of the truck driver, and that's just not fair. So we can ship things over from China into a port in California. We're going to pay a truck driver by the mile so people can buy 25-cent widgets at Walmart. Doesn't make any sense to me.
And I've said this for a couple of years, especially to people that don't understand the industry, how it's always going.
Mm-hmm.
Go down on Christmas morning, spend
Mm-hmm.
some time and sit along an interstate and watch how many trucks are still out Christmas morning.
Yeah,
You'll
yeah,
see local fuel delivery guys still out
yep,
running fuel. You'll see over the road guys, stuff that has to get.
for
Um,
sure.
and for our industry, I think two things that you could change would be the linchpins for it to change for the better
Mm-hmm.
would be putting drivers on an hourly wage and just
Mm-hmm.
saying that's the law, and then creating a tiered system for the licensing where you are providing the safety and the feedback and the licensing of this is a driver that has experience. He's proven safety. He's proven a track record. I think if
Right.
you did those two things, you would create an industry where they would seek that efficiency gain. The
I
industry would come together and say, "Hey, you know
they
what?
have to at
Let's
that
start."
point. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because it's like we can't let the prices skyrocket on everything. So where are we going to get the efficiency? Well, we can't just we can't just bring in a bunch of drivers that are basically barely trained and say that they're as good as a driver that's got 10 years experience. So now we have to really start picking where are we going to improve our efficiency in reality.
No, you're 100% right, and I think the other thing that this speaks to as well, there's no way that it should be cheaper to make something in China, put it on a boat, run it clear over here, and then unload it and then distribute it. The only reason they can afford to do that is because we're all underpaid. That is the only reason they can afford to do that. If we were being paid, if you took what a driver was making just before deregulation and put that in today's money, those guys are making around $150,000, $170,000 a year, and that's what we should be making. But a lot of people think that that's just ridiculous. Um, so
My
we
so my
really
mom
need to
drove
think
over the
about
road.
that. Hmm.
Yeah, my mom drove over the road. I found one of her W-2s a couple years ago. For the last year she drove over the road. Now, granted, this was a dedicated run. She went Big Spring, Texas to Lawton, Oklahoma. You did a round trip a day.
Hmm.
Um, but for her, she did that for the full year. Her W-2 was $83,000.
Hmm.
She retired from driving in
Hmm.
2004.
Hmm.
So 2004 to today, she was making more money
Oh
than
yeah,
than most
yeah,
drivers are making today.
yeah,
And that
right.
that run was she woke up. She had an apartment in Lawton, Oklahoma. She would
Hmm.
wake up, drive to Big Springs, Texas, drop a
Hmm.
trailer, hook up to a loaded one, bring it to Lawton, Oklahoma to Goodyear,
Hmm.
and that was then she'd go home.
Hmm.
That was what she did.
Hmm.
It's like that, and making that kind of money, you don't have that many jobs that you can do that nowadays. The pay
That
just
yeah,
it's
that's
become
true.
completely stagnant.
That is true. In the transportation industry specifically, we've really suffered. Now, as our pay went down, when you look in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, the Rust Belt, so to speak, you've seen all these little machine shops, you've seen all these little factories and businesses. They're just gone nowadays. The little town that I grew up in Ohio, it's pretty much deserted. All the factories are gone. Everything's being made overseas, and unfortunately, we're a cog in the wheel that enabled that because we are working for what we're working for. And it's not that we specifically as drivers said, hey, I want to work for less. It was during deregulation. Um, some people sat around and thought about this. Gee, look how cheap we get this stuff moved, and look what we can do here, and we can make a ton of money off these poor saps. Is exactly what happened. There's no doubt in my mind that was well thought out and executed because it just completely destroyed the wage infrastructure in the industry. Since '75, it's been a downhill slope ever since deregulation ended, and it's going to continue to drop unless somebody it will continue to drop until the supply chain corrodes to the point where people can't get what they want. And then when they can't get what they want, oh, how do we fix this? You know what I mean? That's what's going to happen. And we get closer to that every day. I hope we don't have to get to that point before somebody says this isn't fair, we need to fix this, but we'll see what happens.
It'll be it will be very interesting. Time will tell, but I feel like we are reaching a point now where um, there's going to have to be a change. There's going to have to be a give at some. And I as much as I hate the idea of more government involvement. I'm very much a person that is also realistic that the government's going to do something to try and
Yeah,
fix it. And
I
as an industry, like I said, as a driver, I came up with this document. As an industry, I feel like as an industry, if we put something together, preempted the government, and said this is what we've come up with, that will do a lot better. Because they
what
said they wanted more hours for the driver to drive. The 10 and 8 was overall a better logging system. We gained an hour to drive. We picked up so many other on the back end, so many other restrictions that really just it wasn't worth that extra hour.
so I think as as an industry, especially as the owner operators, the independents, the small carriers, we do a horrible job at representing ourselves. You see these trucking protests, and I just want to cry when I see this stuff. You get guys flipping off the camera, and these stupid slogans and sayings, and they demand this and they demand that. There's nothing that's even remotely possible. They put out all these demands and all these things that they want to have that really do nothing to solve the problem. It might make an individual trucker's job a little nicer, but it doesn't necessarily universally impact the industry as a whole. And so we struggle with that because we are independent people. As independent owner operators, we don't want to be part of the cog in the wheel. We want to do things our own way. And you know, if I sit down and think about things hard enough, I can still be successful within the system that we're working. Doesn't mean that system's right, though. There are some fundamental flaws with this system, and it's pretty horrific. I don't think the average person understands how poorly paid truck drivers are for what they do. And this is why we have such problems hiring new people. That's why they want to bring in all the foreigners to come drive. I have nothing against a foreigner that wants to come drive, but I understand the reason why they're bringing them in. That's what I have the problem with. Why can't we get people to drive truck here in the United States? Because we don't pay what we should pay them. We don't have the benefits that they should have. You know, a lot of people say, well, nobody wants to be away from home. People will be away from home if they're paid to be away from home. You just don't want to pay people what they deserve, and that's a big part of the problem.
I've also I also think area that our industry is the world is kind of shifting to is people are more willing to be away from home if they're paid more, but also being away with technology, give them some of the technology. And I don't
Oh
mean
yeah, yeah.
like don't give them a laptop, don't give them, but provide in the truck an internet connection that
Yes,
they can
yeah,
video call their family
right, right.
because it might not
Have that
seem like a
connection.
lot, but
It's
that
huge.
internet connection in the truck that they can sit down with their phone or with their laptop and say, "Hey, I'm going to pull this up," even
Yeah.
especially with a laptop because you have a bigger screen, you can really see what your kids are doing. You can read a book to your kids. You can
Yep.
that helps them stay connected and a part of the family that drivers in the past just they just I mean you know as
You
well as
never,
anybody
yeah, right, right. You
you
never
just
got. I can't
you
tell you how much homework I done with my kids after I got an iPad. You know what I mean? It was just amazing to me because I was started out no cell phone. A cell phone was a rarity. In fact, when I started, there was no cell phones. And you stopped at the truck stop, you stood in line like everybody else and waited to get to the payphone. And then when it got to the point where I could actually do homework with my kids, um, that was huge for me. I really enjoyed it actually. I mean, that was one of the things that I thought was just awesome about technology. And you're 100% right that we need to leverage every benefit that we can. And you know, the nicer trucks are helpful. The technology to be able to communicate instantly with your family when needed is extremely helpful. And so there has been a lot of improvements that have been made over the years. There's no doubt. It's just we struggle with this pay issue, and honestly, it all just keeps boiling back to pay by the mile has to go away. No percentage of the load, no pay by the mile. If for a company driver, now an owner operator, you negotiate whatever you want to negotiate. I don't care. But if you're an employee, you're going to get paid. There's going to be time value associated there with overtime. Um, Bottom line. And until that happens, it's going to be difficult to overcome all of the issues that we have going on in this industry. I think we fix pay, then we'll be able to create that tiered system so then we have a career pathway. I think that's super important. I've been doing it for 37 years, and realistically, take away the testing and consulting, I'm no further ahead than when I started. That's just the
and
bottom line.
another part of if we get rid of the pay by the mile, we go to an hourly wage where we get overtime. Drivers are going to be a lot more willing to do a pre-trip, and then when they see something that's even a
Of
little bit wrong,
course.
they'll be like,
Of
you know
course.
what?
I'm
Because
getting
I did
paid.
for a while. I did local. I was paid by the hour doing local work, and I had so little stress because you know what? Oh, there's a traffic jam. Okay, big deal. Oh, I did a pre-trip on the truck, and I found when I pulled into the yard, I ran over a screw,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now I've got a flat tire.
Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm paid
Yeah.
by the hour.
Yep.
Let's sit here. Let's get this fixed. Let's not try and just. I'm going to air it up real quick, and then I'll try and run it, and I'll air it up 3 or 4 times through the day.
Yep.
No, we'll just
Yeah.
get it fixed right
Spot
now.
on. Spot on, my friend. I do the same thing on occasion. My brother's busy. He'll say, "Hey, can you run something for me today?" I say, "Yeah, I got nothing going on." He pays me by the hour. I run local. Same way. I got into a McLean's distribution center, and they had me there, I don't know, 8 hours while they were unloading. And the woman at the window, she's a pop. I said, "Don't worry about it. Any hour, it's okay. I really don't care." You know what I mean? I was just jumping back, and I get paid to lay down and go to sleep. And if I was getting paid by the mile, I'd be at that window pounding on it, pissed off because I'm losing my ass here. You know what I mean? And that stuff has to end. It's not fair to anybody, and it really just enables a lot of these foreign countries to bring things to market that they shouldn't be able to bring to market. Really, is what we're talking about. The talk today a lot of is about having tariffs. Well, fix our pay. That's kind of a tariff, right? You know what I mean? Fix our pay, and you won't need the tariff, right?
Make it where paying the driver isn't the cheapest part of the whole equation.
Exactly. You're exactly right. It needs to be. It needs to be addressed. There's no doubt about it.
Well, on that note, I think we will go ahead and wrap this up. It's been a pleasure talking to you, learning about the technology and discussing a little bit about other aspects of the industry and the history there that we have with it. So
Sure, absolutely. It was great, Daniel, and if you want to have me back at some point, I'd be glad to come back. The discussion was fun and interesting. So.
Oh, absolutely. We'll have to bring you on sometime and just do a focus on weight biasing and
Hey, there you go.
the
I could
powertrain
go.
stuff.
I could go for a couple hours on that too.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Joel Morrow. You can find him all over social media. Pretty much just type in the big purple Volvo that does all the strange things, or Joel Morrow.
There you go.
Have a great day.